fix it if you're so smart," the engineer scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured dismissively toward the broken industrial cleaning machine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Detroit municipal yard, highlighting the stark contrast between his pristine white hard hat and the weathered orange safety vest of the man standing before him. Steam rose from the coffee in his hands while he watched with amusement, expecting nothing more than fumbling incompetence. The machine's complex hydraulic system had been leaking for 3 days, shutting down street cleaning operations in the downtown district. His team of certified technicians had already spent 18 hours trying to diagnose the problem, their expensive diagnostic tools and engineering degrees proving useless against the stubborn malfunction. The engineer's smirk widened as he anticipated the inevitable failure, ready to use it as another example of why some people should stick to their simple jobs. Little did he know that this moment would shatter every assumption he'd ever held about intelligence, worth, and the true meaning of expertise. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Marcus Washington had heard them all before. If you've ever been underestimated because of your job or appearance, you know exactly how that feels, that burning mixture of hurt and determination. Share with me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me about a time when someone doubted you. At 62 years old, Marcus had been cleaning the streets of Detroit for 37 years, his calloused hands and weathered face telling stories of countless dawns spent keeping the city beautiful. His deep brown eyes held the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from decades of observation, problem-solving, and being overlooked by people who confused education with intelligence. The navy blue uniform he wore with pride bore the city seal, and though it was faded from countless washings, he kept it impeccably clean and pressed. His graying hair was always neatly trimmed, and despite the physical demands of his job, he carried himself with a dignity that no amount of condescension could diminish. Marcus had raised 3 children on a street cleaner's salary, put 2 through college, and had been fixing broken things his entire life out of necessity and natural curiosity. The municipal yard buzzed with morning activity as city workers prepared for another day of serving Detroit's residents. Yellow garbage trucks lined up like sleeping giants waiting to be awakened, while smaller maintenance vehicles scattered across the concrete expanse like busy ants. The air carried the familiar mixture of diesel fumes, coffee, and the crisp October morning that promised another beautiful Michigan day. Supervisors called out assignments over crackling radios, while mechanics in coveralls emerged from the repair bay, grease-stained and already focused on their daily battles with aging city equipment. The American flag snapped proudly in the autumn breeze above the main office building, where bureaucrats in suits would soon arrive to make decisions about budgets and policies. This was Marcus's world, a place where honest work happened every day, where people took pride in serving their community, despite being largely invisible to those they served. The contrast between this blue-collar environment and the corporate engineering firm's temporary presence felt as stark as oil and water refusing to mix. The broken cleaning machine stood like a mechanical monument to frustration in the center of the yard. Its massive rotating brushes hung motionless, and hydraulic fluid had formed a dark puddle beneath its undercarriage, creating a rainbow sheen that caught the morning light. The machine, worth over $200,000, had been the pride of the fleet just weeks ago, capable of cleaning 4 lanes simultaneously, while its powerful vacuum system collected debris and water. Now it sat defeated, surrounded by diagnostic equipment worth more than Marcus made in a year, none of which had been able to identify the source of the persistent hydraulic leak. The engineer, James Patterson, 28 years old with an MIT degree and designer glasses, had flown in from the manufacturer's headquarters specifically to solve this problem. His confidence had gradually eroded over 3 days of failed attempts, but his arrogance remained intact, especially when dealing with what he considered the help. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that this expensive machine, designed to clean the very streets he'd been maintaining by hand for decades, couldn't even clean itself of its own mechanical problems. Marcus approached the machine with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that real expertise often came without certificates or recognition. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he circled the massive piece of equipment, his experienced eyes already beginning their assessment. He'd watched the engineering team work for 3 days, observed their methods, listened to their theories, and noticed what they had consistently overlooked. While they focused on complex computerized diagnostics and consulted technical manuals, Marcus saw the machine the way a farmer sees a horse, as a living, breathing entity with its own personality and quirks. His hands, scarred from decades of honest work, ran along the hydraulic lines with the gentle touch of someone reading Braille. The other city workers had gathered at a respectful distance, some hoping for vindication, others fearing another public humiliation for one of their own. They knew Marcus's reputation for fixing things, but they also understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a broken machine, it was about respect, dignity, and the value of experience versus education. The morning shift was in full swing, and the pressure to resolve the situation was mounting with each passing hour. Downtown Detroit's streets were accumulating debris, and the mayor's office had been calling for updates every few hours. The local news had picked up the story about the expensive machine that even its own engineers couldn't repair, turning what should have been a routine maintenance issue into a public embarrassment for the city. Contract penalties were piling up, and the manufacturer's reputation was on the line, which explained why they'd sent their supposedly best troubleshooter. James Patterson shifted impatiently, checking his expensive watch and thinking about his flight back to Boston scheduled for that evening. His colleagues back at headquarters were waiting for his status report, expecting him to confirm what they already believed, that municipal workers didn't understand sophisticated equipment and that the problem was likely operator error or poor maintenance. The stereotype reinforced their worldview and protected their professional egos, but it also blinded them to possibilities they'd never considered. Marcus represented everything they'd been taught to dismiss, yet here he was, studying their unsolvable problem with the intensity of a master craftsman. The other city workers knew they were witnessing something significant, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what. Detroit had always been a city that respected practical knowledge, where generations of auto workers had built the machines that built America. The old-timers remembered when the city's streets were cleaned by teams of men with brooms and determination, before million-dollar machines and computer diagnostics became the supposed solutions to every problem. They'd seen Marcus fix everything from broken traffic lights to stuck garbage truck compactors, using nothing but ingenuity and experience. His reputation was built on countless small miracles performed without fanfare or recognition, solutions that saved the city thousands of dollars and kept essential services running. Today felt different, though, charged with the kind of tension that comes when worlds collide and assumptions are challenged. The younger workers watched with smartphones ready, instinctively sensing that history might be made in the next few minutes. Social media had given voice to moments like these, where ordinary people could shine light on extraordinary acts of quiet competence. Marcus's examination continued methodically, his movements deliberate and purposeful, in stark contrast to the frantic energy that had characterized the previous 3 days of failed repairs. He knelt beside the machine's main hydraulic pump, placing his ear against the metal housing with the concentration of a doctor, listening to a patient's heartbeat. The engineer scoffed audibly at this primitive diagnostic technique, making jokes to his assistant about old-school methods in an age of digital precision. What James didn't understand was that Marcus had learned to listen to machines the same way a musician listens to an orchestra, able to detect subtle variations in rhythm and tone that revealed hidden problems. His fingers traced the path of hydraulic lines, feeling for temperature variations and subtle vibrations that expensive sensors had missed. The machine's service manual lay open on a nearby workbench, its pages filled with technical diagrams and specifications, but Marcus read the machine itself like a book written in the language of mechanical sympathy. His education had come from necessity, curiosity, and 37 years of making things work when they were supposed to be broken beyond repair. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more pronounced as they represented different worlds of knowledge and experience. James Patterson embodied the modern belief that intelligence came from universities and credentials, that complex problems required complex solutions applied by specially trained experts. His toolkit consisted of laptop computers, digital multimeters, and diagnostic software that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Marcus Washington represented an older tradition of understanding, where knowledge was earned through direct experience, patient observation, and the kind of intuitive problem-solving that couldn't be taught in classrooms. His toolkit consisted of basic hand tools, most of them older than the engineer standing nearby, along with an encyclopedic knowledge of how things worked when they worked right. The morning sun climbed higher in the Detroit sky, casting shorter shadows, but illuminating more clearly the gulf between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. One man had spent 4 years studying engineering principles in climate-controlled lecture halls. The other had spent 4 decades learning how the real world actually operated under all conditions and circumstances. The tension in the municipal yard was palpable as Marcus continued his examination, oblivious to the skeptical stares and whispered conversations surrounding him. He understood that he was being set up for public failure, that his inability to fix this machine would be used to justify every condescending attitude and dismissive comment he'd endured throughout his career. But Marcus also understood something that his detractors didn't. He had nothing to lose and everything to prove, not for himself, but for every working person who'd ever been made to feel small by someone with a degree and an attitude. His hands moved with surgical precision as he identified potential problem areas, his mind processing information gathered through senses that had been refined by decades of practical application. The machine's complexity didn't intimidate him, because he understood that underneath all the bells and whistles it was still just a machine designed to perform a simple function: clean streets. Complexity was often added by people who confused sophistication with effectiveness, who believed that expensive solutions were automatically better solutions. The morning coffee break came and went, but no one moved from their positions around the broken machine. Word had spread through the municipal building that something unprecedented was happening in the yard, and employees found excuses to step outside and witness what was unfolding. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A street cleaner challenging an MIT engineer represented something larger than a simple repair job. It was about respect, recognition, and the fundamental question of what constituted real intelligence in a world increasingly dominated by credentials and certificates. Marcus felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him like a physical force, but he'd carried heavier burdens before and emerged stronger. His children had grown up hearing him say that a person's worth wasn't measured by their paycheck or their title, but by their character and their willingness to help others. Now he had a chance to demonstrate that principle in front of witnesses who might finally understand what he'd always known, that dignity came from within, not from external validation or recognition. The engineer's impatience was becoming more obvious with each passing minute as he checked his watch repeatedly and made increasingly pointed comments about wasting time on futile gestures. James Patterson had built his career on being the expert, the problem solver, the man companies called when their own people couldn't handle sophisticated equipment. His professional identity was tied to being indispensable, and the longer Marcus spent examining the machine, the more that identity felt threatened. He'd never encountered someone who refused to be intimidated by his credentials or impressed by his expertise, someone who approached complex problems with calm confidence instead of deferential respect. The cognitive dissonance was uncomfortable, challenging assumptions he'd held since graduate school about the hierarchy of intelligence and the monopoly-educated professionals held on complex problem-solving. His discomfort manifested as increased arrogance and louder dismissals of Marcus's methodical approach, but underneath the bluster was a growing uneasiness about what might happen if the impossible occurred. Marcus finally stood up from his examination, wiping his hands on the clean shop rag he always carried in his back pocket. His face revealed nothing of his thoughts or conclusions, maintaining the poker face that had served him well in countless confrontations with supervisors, politicians, and other people who confused volume with authority. The assembled crowd held its collective breath, sensing that the moment of truth had arrived, but uncertain what form it would take. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with routine municipal business, but all attention focused on the 2 men standing beside the broken machine that had confounded experts and threatened to embarrass everyone involved. The October morning had warmed considerably, but the tension in the air made everyone acutely aware that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and retold long after the machine was running again. History was being written in real time, measured not in years or decades, but in the few minutes that would determine whether experience could triumph over credentials, whether practical knowledge could solve problems that theoretical expertise had failed to understand. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about intelligence, expertise, and the true measure of a person's worth. Marcus Washington, street cleaner and unrecognized mechanical genius, was about to prove that some problems required not just knowledge but wisdom, and that wisdom often came dressed in work clothes instead of business suits. The silence that followed Marcus's examination felt like the pause before thunder, heavy with the weight of unspoken judgments and buried pain. For 37 years, he had endured moments like this: the skeptical stares, the dismissive laughter, the automatic assumption that his weathered hands couldn't possibly understand sophisticated machinery. The municipal yard had become a theater of class warfare, where his dignity would once again be put on trial by people who had never spent a day doing the work that kept their world functioning. Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest, the same hollow feeling that had accompanied every promotion denied, every suggestion ignored, every time his expertise was dismissed because it came without a diploma. The October morning air seemed to press against him like a physical weight, carrying the accumulated burden of decades spent proving himself to people who would never truly see him. He had learned to swallow his anger, to channel his frustration into the methodical pursuit of excellence. But standing here now, he felt the old wounds reopening. The engineer's expensive tools lay scattered around the machine like artifacts of failed ambition, while his simple approach had already revealed what their sophistication had missed. The memories came flooding back as they always did in moments of confrontation, transporting him to a small apartment on Detroit's east side, where everything had started. He was 8 years old again, watching his father, Samuel Washington, spread newspaper across their kitchen table and carefully disassemble the family's broken radio with hands that moved like those of a surgeon. Samuel worked the night shift at Ford Motor Company, but his real genius emerged in their cramped living room, where he transformed mechanical failures into working miracles. There were no manuals, no diagnostic equipment, just a man's intuitive understanding of how things were supposed to work, and the patience to discover why they didn't. Marcus remembered the musty smell of old electronics, the soft jazz playing from their neighbor's apartment, and the way his father's face lit up when he finally heard the radio crackle back to life. Those evenings became his first classroom, where he learned that intelligence wasn't something you earned in school, but something you developed through curiosity, persistence, and respect for the mysterious logic that governed mechanical things. His father never got the recognition he deserved for his brilliance, dying at 52 with a toolbox full of solutions and a heart full of dreams he'd never seen fulfilled. The contrast between his father's quiet wisdom and the engineer's loud arrogance felt like a betrayal of everything Marcus held sacred about honest work. Samuel Washington had taught him that fixing things wasn't just about mechanical knowledge. It was about listening, observing, and understanding the story that broken objects were trying to tell. He remembered countless Saturday mornings spent in the basement workshop that his father had built with salvaged materials, learning to feel the subtle differences in how metals expanded and contracted, how fluids moved through systems, how electrical currents found their paths through complex circuits. The lessons weren't formal or structured, just a father sharing his passion with a son who hungered to understand how the world actually worked beneath its polished surfaces. Samuel had never owned expensive diagnostic equipment, but he could diagnose problems by sound, touch, and instinct that had been refined through thousands of hours of patient practice. The irony struck Marcus now that his father's approach, dismissed by educated people as primitive, had been more sophisticated than any computer program because it incorporated variables that no algorithm could process: human intuition, mechanical empathy, and the wisdom that came from understanding that every machine had its own personality and preferred methods of communication. Growing up in Detroit during the civil rights era had taught Marcus early lessons about dignity and perseverance that no classroom could provide. He remembered walking to school past houses where entire families worked in the auto plants, their pride evident in the way they maintained their properties and carried themselves despite facing constant discrimination. The neighborhood had been a tapestry of working families, black, white, Polish, Italian, all united by their belief that honest labor had intrinsic value and that a person's character mattered more than their circumstances. His mother, Dorothy, worked as a seamstress in a downtown factory, her fingers flying across fabric with the same precision that his father applied to mechanical repairs. She would come home exhausted, but always found time to help with homework, to listen to his day, to remind him that education was important, but that wisdom came from many sources. The Washington family dinner table had been his second classroom, where current events were discussed with the same seriousness as family finances, where every member's opinion was valued regardless of age or formal education. Those conversations had shaped his understanding that intelligence took many forms and that society's measures of worth often overlooked its most valuable contributors. The path from those formative years to this confrontation had been marked by countless small humiliations and quiet victories that the world never acknowledged. Marcus remembered his first day as a city employee at 19, eager to prove himself worthy of the uniform that represented stability and purpose in his community. The other workers had been welcoming, recognizing in him the work ethic and mechanical aptitude that his father had instilled. But the supervisors had been different. They saw a young black man who should be grateful for steady employment and shouldn't aspire beyond his assigned role. Over the years, he had submitted dozens of suggestions for improving equipment and procedures, most of which were implemented quietly, without credit or acknowledgement. He had trained new employees, shared his expertise freely, and consistently demonstrated the kind of innovative problem-solving that should have led to advancement. Instead, he had watched less experienced workers with college degrees move into management positions while his contributions remained invisible. The pattern had become so predictable that he had stopped expecting recognition and focused instead on the satisfaction that came from doing excellent work, regardless of who noticed. But the hurt had accumulated like sediment in his soul, creating layers of disappointment that never fully disappeared. The machine in front of him represented more than just another repair job. It was a symbol of everything he had been denied throughout his career. Its complex hydraulic systems and computerized controls were designed by engineers who assumed that sophistication automatically meant superiority, who believed that expensive solutions were inherently better than simple ones. The irony wasn't lost on him that this mechanical marvel, created by people with advanced degrees and unlimited budgets, couldn't perform its basic function because its designers had overlooked fundamental principles that any experienced mechanic would have considered. He thought about all the times he had fixed similar problems on older, simpler equipment, using nothing but observation, logic, and the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be taught in engineering school. The contrast highlighted a divide that went deeper than just different approaches to problem solving. It reflected fundamentally different philosophies about intelligence, value, and the nature of expertise itself. Marcus had spent decades proving that practical wisdom could solve problems that theoretical knowledge couldn't even identify. But those victories had remained largely invisible to the people who made decisions about careers and recognition. The weight of representing more than just himself pressed down on Marcus like a physical force as he prepared to demonstrate what experience could accomplish. Every city employee watching understood that this moment was about more than mechanical repair. It was about respect for the intelligence that emerged from years of hands-on experience, about dignity for people whose expertise came from work rather than schooling. He thought about his 3 children, all of whom had achieved the educational success that he had been denied, but who still faced assumptions about their capabilities based on their father's occupation. His daughter Sarah, now a nurse practitioner in Chicago, had told him about colleagues who seemed surprised by her clinical insights, as if intelligence couldn't possibly run in the family of a street cleaner. His sons, both engineers themselves, had achieved the formal recognition that had eluded their father, but they understood better than anyone that their success had been built on the foundation of practical wisdom he had provided. The circular nature of the situation, that his children's engineering education might have given them credibility to solve this problem, while his superior experience was automatically dismissed, exemplified the institutional biases that had shaped his entire career. Standing there in the Detroit morning sun, Marcus felt the full weight of his 62 years and the accumulated wisdom they represented. His body bore the evidence of decades spent in service to his city, the slight stoop in his shoulders from countless hours bent over his work, the permanent grease stains under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove, the network of small scars that told stories of mechanical battles won and lost. But his mind remained sharp, filled with an encyclopedic knowledge of how things broke and how they could be fixed, enriched by experiences that no textbook could provide. The young engineer's dismissive attitude reminded him of dozens of similar encounters over the years. Moments when his expertise had been questioned, his suggestions ignored, his insights dismissed because they came from the wrong person in the wrong uniform. Each of those moments had carved away a small piece of his professional confidence, but they had also reinforced his determination to excel at his work, regardless of recognition. The accumulated effect had been to create a man who knew his own worth, even when others couldn't see it, who had learned to find satisfaction in excellence rather than external validation. The machine's stubborn malfunction seemed to mock everyone who had tried to solve it, but Marcus recognized in its defiance a familiar pattern that he had encountered countless times before. Complex systems often failed because of simple problems that were hidden by their very obviousness. A loose connection, a misaligned component, a setting that had been overlooked because it seemed too basic to matter. He had learned to approach such problems with what his father had called humble curiosity, the willingness to consider possibilities that more educated people might dismiss as too elementary to investigate. The engineer's sophisticated diagnostic equipment had been searching for complex electronic failures and exotic mechanical breakdowns, but Marcus suspected that the real problem was probably something much more fundamental. His decades of experience had taught him that the most expensive machines were often the most fragile, designed by people who prioritized innovation over reliability, who assumed that computerized systems would automatically be better than mechanical ones. The irony was that this cutting-edge cleaning machine had probably failed because of a problem that would have been obvious to any mechanic from his father's generation, hidden beneath layers of modern complexity, like a simple truth buried under academic jargon. The faces surrounding him represented different aspects of the class and educational divide that had defined his career and shaped his understanding of American society. The younger city workers looked hopeful but uncertain, torn between loyalty to one of their own and realistic assessment of the odds against him. The older employees wore expressions of resigned support, having witnessed too many similar confrontations end in disappointment to allow themselves much optimism. The supervisors seemed caught between hope for a solution and fear of the implications if Marcus succeeded where expensive experts had failed. Their discomfort was palpable, as if his potential success would somehow reflect poorly on their own decision-making and judgment. The engineers maintained their professional skepticism, but Marcus detected underlying anxiety in their body language that suggested they weren't as confident as they pretended to be. The moment had become a test of competing worldviews, where different definitions of intelligence and expertise would be measured against the simple standard of results. Marcus understood that fixing this machine wouldn't change the fundamental biases that had shaped his career, but it might give others the courage to challenge assumptions about who deserved respect and recognition. The memories of his father's quiet wisdom provided the emotional foundation he needed to face this public challenge with dignity and confidence. Samuel Washington had never sought recognition for his mechanical genius, finding satisfaction instead in the simple act of making broken things work again. He had taught his son that true expertise was measured not by certificates or credentials, but by the ability to solve problems that others couldn't, to see solutions that were hidden from people who thought too much and felt too little. The lesson had been reinforced through decades of watching his father fix everything, from household appliances to neighborhood cars, always with the same methodical approach that combined technical knowledge with intuitive understanding. Samuel had died without ever receiving public acknowledgement for his brilliance, but his workshop had become a gathering place for people who needed help and couldn't afford to pay professional repair services. His legacy lived on in the countless objects he had restored to usefulness and in the son who had inherited both his mechanical gifts and his humble approach to sharing them with others. Marcus felt his father's presence like a guardian spirit as he prepared to demonstrate that some forms of intelligence couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The hydraulic system's persistent leak had stumped engineers who approached it as a complex technical problem requiring sophisticated analysis and expensive solutions. But Marcus had learned from his father to listen to what broken machines were trying to communicate, to understand their mechanical language of sounds, smells, and subtle behavioral changes. As he had examined the equipment, his hands had been gathering information that his mind was processing through filters of experience that no computer program could replicate. The machine's problem was probably hiding in plain sight, disguised as something too simple for educated people to consider seriously. He had seen similar patterns hundreds of times, complex systems failing because of basic maintenance issues that had been overlooked, fundamental problems that were invisible to people who expected sophisticated causes for expensive failures. The irony struck him that his father's generation of mechanics had understood intuitively what modern engineers were struggling to rediscover, that mechanical systems were essentially simple, that complexity was usually added by people who confused sophistication with effectiveness, and that the most elegant solutions were often the most obvious ones. Standing there in the Detroit morning sun, Marcus felt the weight of his heritage and the power of the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of working people who knew how to fix things when they broke. The moment of truth was approaching, and Marcus understood that he was about to either validate a lifetime of accumulated wisdom or confirm every stereotype. The stakes felt enormous, not just for him personally, but for every working person who had ever been made to feel inferior. His hands trembled slightly as he selected the tool he would need, not from nervousness, but from accumulated energy. The machine stood before him like a mechanical judge, its silent hydraulic system holding secrets that expensive diagnostics had failed to reveal. Around him, the Detroit morning continued its routine progression, but time seemed suspended in this corner of the municipal yard. Different philosophies of knowledge were about to be tested against the unforgiving standard of results, where theories would meet reality. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his father's teachings, his family's pride, and his own dignity. The tool in his hand was older than the engineer standing nearby, worn smooth by decades of use, but still perfectly functional. It represented everything that separated practical wisdom from theoretical knowledge: simplicity, reliability, and effectiveness, born from experience rather than innovation. The irony wasn't lost on him that this humble instrument might succeed where thousands of dollars of sophisticated equipment had failed. His father had taught him that the best tools were often the ones that had proven themselves over time, that had been refined through use rather than designed by committee. The weight of the tool in his calloused palm felt familiar and reassuring, like shaking hands with an old friend who had never let him down. As Marcus positioned himself beside the machine, he felt the collective breath of the municipal yard being held, the silence pregnant with possibility. The next few minutes would determine whether a lifetime of learning could triumph over expensive education, whether dignity could overcome condescension, whether the wisdom of experience could solve what the sophistication of theory had failed to understand. The simple adjustable wrench in Marcus's weathered hand might as well have been Excalibur, given the skeptical stares it drew from the assembled crowd. James Patterson let out an audible snort of derision, shaking his head at what he considered the ultimate display of mechanical ignorance. The engineer's expensive diagnostic laptop remained open nearby, its screen filled with complex hydraulic system schematics that had yielded no solutions despite 3 days of analysis. Marcus ignored the whispered comments and focused his attention on a component that every sophisticated scan had overlooked: a simple pressure relief valve located beneath the machine's main hydraulic reservoir. While the engineering team had concentrated on the high-tech electronic sensors and computerized control systems, Marcus had noticed something far more fundamental during his methodical examination. The valve's position indicator, barely visible beneath layers of accumulated grime and road salt, was showing a setting that didn't match the specifications painted on the machine's data plate. It was the kind of basic mechanical detail that sophisticated diagnostics couldn't detect, because it wasn't designed to look for human error in manual settings. The revelation struck him with the force of clarity that comes when experience recognizes a pattern that education has missed entirely. "Found your problem," Marcus announced quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of certainty rather than the desperate hope of someone guessing. The words cut through the morning air like a blade, causing conversations to stop mid-sentence and heads to turn in his direction. James Patterson's expression shifted from smug amusement to irritated skepticism, his professional pride unable to accept that a municipal employee could identify what his team had missed. The other city workers leaned forward instinctively, sensing that something significant was about to unfold, but not daring to hope too openly for fear of disappointment. Marcus pointed to the pressure relief valve with the tip of his wrench, his gesture as precise as a surgeon, indicating a critical anatomical detail. The valve itself was unremarkable, a standard industrial component that cost less than $50 and could be found in any hydraulic supply catalog. But its current setting was completely wrong for this machine's operating parameters, creating internal pressure fluctuations that were causing the mysterious leak that had stumped the engineers. The simplicity of the problem stood in stark contrast to the complexity of the solutions that had been attempted, highlighting the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical understanding. The engineer's face flushed red as he pushed past Marcus to examine the valve, his movements sharp, with the kind of aggressive energy that comes from having one's expertise challenged publicly. James squinted at the pressure setting through his designer glasses, comparing it mentally to the specifications he'd memorized from the technical manuals, his expression gradually changing from skepticism to confusion to something approaching recognition. The setting was indeed incorrect, so obviously wrong that it should have been the first thing any competent technician checked, yet it had been invisible to his team because they'd assumed that manual settings were beneath their level of concern. The valve had probably been adjusted incorrectly during routine maintenance months ago, its gradual impact on system pressure creating the intermittent leak that had gradually worsened until it shut down the entire machine. Marcus watched the engineer's internal struggle with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the exact moment when professional arrogance collided with undeniable reality. The crowd of municipal workers began to sense the shift in dynamics, their posture changing from defensive resignation to cautious optimism as they realized their colleague might actually have solved the unsolvable problem. The October morning seemed to grow brighter as the possibility of vindication began to replace the expectation of humiliation. That valve has been set wrong for months, maybe longer, Marcus continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Your pressure relief is opening too early, causing system instability every time the hydraulics cycle under load. The leak gets worse when the machine works harder because the pressure differential increases with demand. His explanation was delivered in plain English rather than technical jargon, making it accessible to everyone present while simultaneously demonstrating his complete understanding of the system's operation. James Patterson's expensive education had taught him to communicate in complex terminology that often obscured rather than illuminated understanding, but Marcus had learned from his father that true expertise was measured by the ability to explain complicated things in simple terms. The engineer's face grew redder as he realized not only that Marcus was correct, but that the solution was embarrassingly basic, the kind of fundamental check that should have been performed before any sophisticated diagnostic procedures were attempted. The other city workers began to straighten their shoulders and stand taller, sensing that their representative was not only holding his own, but actually winning this unlikely confrontation. The implications of Marcus's discovery rippled through the assembled crowd like stones thrown into still water, creating expanding circles of realization about assumptions, expertise, and respect. The supervisors exchanged uncomfortable glances, understanding that this moment would require them to reassess their evaluations of both their employee and the expensive consulting contract they'd approved. The younger workers pulled out their smartphones, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something worth documenting and sharing, a David and Goliath moment that deserved a wider audience. Several of the older employees smiled knowingly, remembering other instances when Marcus had demonstrated similar insights that had been overlooked or dismissed by people with more formal credentials. The engineer's assistant, a recent graduate who had been trained to respect hierarchy and credentials above all else, looked confused and uncertain as his worldview was challenged by this unexpected turn of events. The machine itself seemed to wait patiently for resolution, its massive bulk somehow less intimidating now that its secret had been revealed by someone who understood that mechanical problems usually had mechanical solutions. The morning sun climbed higher in the Detroit sky, casting shorter shadows, but illuminating more clearly the human dynamics that were being transformed by this moment of truth. Marcus moved with deliberate precision as he positioned his wrench on the valve's adjustment mechanism, his movements economical and confident in the way that comes from decades of similar repairs. Each turn of the wrench was measured and purposeful, guided by the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be taught in engineering school, but had to be developed through countless hours of hands-on experience. The valve's resistance told him exactly how far it had been out of adjustment, and his experienced touch could feel the mechanism settling into its proper position with the satisfaction of a puzzle piece finding its correct location. James Patterson watched with growing agitation as Marcus performed what should have been a simple task that any first-year engineering student could handle, but the street cleaner's obvious expertise made the engineer's oversight seem even more glaring. The other spectators held their collective breath as they watched the adjustment being made, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether their faith in practical wisdom had been justified or misplaced. The simplicity of the solution stood in stark contrast to the complexity of the diagnostic procedures that had preceded it, highlighting fundamental differences in approach between theoretical and experiential knowledge. The sound of hydraulic fluid circulation changed subtly as Marcus completed the valve adjustment. A variation so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed it, but unmistakable to someone who had spent decades listening to mechanical systems. The leak that had been steadily dripping hydraulic fluid onto the concrete pavement began to slow, then stopped entirely as system pressure stabilized at the correct operating level. Marcus stepped back from the machine and gestured toward the ignition controls, his calm confidence a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had characterized the previous 3 days of failed repair attempts. "Try starting her up now," he suggested, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what would happen next. James Patterson hesitated, torn between hope for a solution and fear of what it would mean if Marcus had succeeded where his team had failed. The moment stretched taut with tension, as everyone present understood that they were about to witness either vindication or humiliation, either the triumph of experience over education or the confirmation of existing assumptions about expertise and credentials. The machine waited patiently for the test that would prove or disprove Marcus's diagnosis, its mechanical integrity about to be measured against decades of accumulated wisdom. The engineer's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the starter controls, his professional pride warring with the growing realization that he might have been thoroughly outclassed by someone he dismissed as intellectually inferior. The diagnostic equipment that had failed to identify the problem sat nearby like expensive monuments to the limitations of theoretical approach, their sophisticated sensors and computer analysis having missed what experienced observation had detected immediately. Marcus watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had proven a point without needing to boast about it, his dignity intact regardless of the outcome because he knew he had applied his knowledge honestly and competently. The crowd of municipal workers leaned forward collectively, their loyalty to their colleague balanced against realistic assessment of the odds against him in this unlikely confrontation. The October morning seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting to witness whether practical wisdom could triumph over academic credentials, whether a lifetime of experience could solve what expensive education had failed to understand. The moment crystallized into something larger than just a mechanical repair. It became a test of different philosophies about intelligence, worth, and the nature of expertise itself. The machine's powerful diesel engine roared to life with a mechanical growl that seemed to announce its pleasure at being properly understood and correctly repaired. The hydraulic pumps engaged smoothly, their operation now smooth and steady, instead of the erratic cycling that had characterized their malfunction. Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he listened to the system's healthy operation, the sounds telling him everything he needed to know about the success of his simple adjustment. James Patterson's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, embarrassment, and finally a grudging acknowledgement that couldn't be denied in the face of obvious results. The machine's rotating brushes began to turn with smooth precision, its vacuum system engaged properly, and most importantly, no hydraulic fluid leaked from any connection or seal. The other city workers began to cheer and applaud, their voices rising in celebration, not just of the mechanical success, but of the validation of their colleagues' expertise and dignity. The expensive diagnostic equipment sat silent and useless nearby, its sophisticated technology having been completely unnecessary for solving a problem that experience and observation had identified immediately. The moment felt like a vindication of every working person who had ever been underestimated because of their job title or their lack of formal credentials. "How did you know?" James Patterson asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance and replaced by genuine curiosity that bordered on awe. The question hung in the morning air, representing more than just technical interest. It was an acknowledgement that Marcus possessed knowledge that couldn't be found in textbooks or learned in classrooms. Marcus considered his answer carefully, understanding that this was an opportunity to educate rather than humiliate, to build bridges rather than burn them down. The machine continued to run smoothly behind him, its successful operation providing undeniable evidence that practical experience had succeeded where theoretical knowledge had failed. The assembled crowd waited for his response, sensing that they were about to hear something profound about the nature of expertise and the value of accumulated wisdom. The engineer's question represented a crack in the wall of professional arrogance that had defined their interaction, an opening through which understanding might finally flow between two different worlds of knowledge. Marcus recognized the moment as an opportunity to honor his father's memory, while demonstrating that true expertise was always willing to share itself with others who were genuinely interested in learning. "Same way my daddy taught me to listen to everything else that's broken," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of generations of practical wisdom passed down from father to son. "You stop looking for complicated explanations and start paying attention to what the machine is actually trying to tell you." His answer encapsulated decades of accumulated knowledge while remaining humble enough to acknowledge the source of his understanding. The engineer nodded slowly, beginning to grasp that he had encountered a form of intelligence that his expensive education had never prepared him to recognize or appreciate. The other workers smiled at Marcus's reference to his father, many of them remembering Samuel Washington and understanding the continuity of wisdom that connected generations of skilled craftsmen. The moment represented more than just a successful repair. It was a bridge between different worlds of knowledge, a demonstration that expertise could take many forms and come from unexpected sources. The machine's steady operation provided a soundtrack of vindication, its mechanical voice adding testimony to the power of experience over assumption, wisdom over credentials, and humility over arrogance. The transformation in the municipal yard's atmosphere was palpable as word of Marcus's success began to spread beyond the immediate witnesses. Radio chatter carried news of the resolution throughout the city's maintenance network, and supervisors who had been preparing damage control reports suddenly found themselves celebrating an unexpected victory. The expensive consulting contract that had brought James Patterson to Detroit was revealed as unnecessary, the problem having been solved by an employee whose annual salary was less than the engineer's weekly fees. Marcus began the process of explaining his methodology to anyone who was interested in learning, his natural teaching ability emerging as he shared insights that had been accumulated over decades of hands-on experience. The morning sun climbed higher in the Detroit sky, illuminating not just the successful repair, but the human transformation that had accompanied it, the restoration of dignity, the validation of expertise, and the recognition that intelligence could take many forms. The machine continued to run perfectly, its operation now a testament to the power of practical wisdom and the value of treating every person's knowledge with respect and consideration. The engineer's smartphone buzzed with calls from his headquarters, colleagues eager to hear about the resolution of the problem that had stumped their best troubleshooter. James Patterson found himself in the unfamiliar position of having to explain that a municipal street cleaner had solved in minutes what his team couldn't resolve in 3 days. A conversation that would challenge his supervisor's assumptions about expertise just as much as his own had been challenged. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that the most sophisticated diagnostic equipment money could buy had been rendered obsolete by a 50-year-old adjustable wrench and 62 years of accumulated experience. Marcus continued to answer questions and share insights with anyone who was interested, his generosity of spirit evident as he transformed what could have been a moment of triumph into an opportunity for mutual learning and understanding. The municipal yard had become an impromptu classroom where different forms of knowledge were being shared and appreciated, where the artificial barriers between theoretical and practical expertise were beginning to dissolve. The machine's steady operation provided a constant reminder that results, not credentials, were the ultimate measure of true competence and understanding. The aftermath of Marcus's triumph rippled through the municipal yard like waves spreading across still water, transforming not just the immediate situation, but the very foundation of how everyone present understood intelligence and worth. James Patterson stood beside the perfectly functioning machine, his expensive diagnostic equipment now seeming almost comically irrelevant in the face of such elegant simplicity. The engineer's smartphone continued to buzz with increasingly urgent calls from his headquarters, colleagues demanding explanations for how their most sophisticated troubleshooter had been outperformed by a city employee with a $50 wrench. His professional identity, built on years of being the expert everyone called when technology failed, was crumbling like a house of cards in a strong wind. The other municipal workers gathered closer, their initial hesitation replaced by growing confidence, as they realized their colleague hadn't just fixed a machine, he'd proven that practical wisdom deserved the same respect as theoretical knowledge. The morning sun cast different shadows now, illuminating faces that showed wonder, admiration, and a new understanding of what expertise actually meant when measured against real results. The machine's steady operation provided a constant soundtrack to this transformation, its mechanical voice bearing witness to the power of experience over assumption. Marcus felt the weight of vindication settling on his shoulders like a comfortable old coat, but it wasn't the bitter satisfaction of revenge that filled his heart. Instead, he experienced the deep contentment that comes from being truly seen and appreciated for who he had always been. The faces surrounding him showed expressions he had rarely encountered in 37 years of city service: genuine respect, admiration, and curiosity about the knowledge he possessed. Young workers who had never given him more than a polite nod were now asking questions about hydraulic systems, mechanical troubleshooting, and the kind of practical wisdom that couldn't be found in textbooks. The supervisors who had routinely overlooked his suggestions were taking notes on his explanation. Their attitudes fundamentally shifted by witnessing expertise they hadn't known existed right under their noses. Marcus thought about his father, Samuel, wishing the old man could see this moment of recognition, this validation of the wisdom that had been passed down through generations of working people who understood how the world actually functioned. The machine continued to run flawlessly, its operation a mechanical prayer of gratitude for finally being properly understood and correctly treated by someone who spoke its language. James Patterson's transformation was perhaps the most profound of all, his journey from arrogance to humility playing out in real time for everyone to witness. The young engineer had built his identity around being intellectually superior to people like Marcus, his MIT degree serving as both shield and weapon in professional confrontations. Now he found himself genuinely curious about the methodology that had solved his impossible problem, his questions sincere rather than condescending for the first time since his arrival in Detroit. "I never learned to listen to machines the way you do," he admitted, his voice carrying a vulnerability that surprised everyone, including himself. "We were taught that sophisticated diagnostics could solve any problem, but you just proved that sometimes the simplest approach is the most effective." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the courage it took for someone to admit their limitations so publicly. The engineer's willingness to learn represented hope that the divide between theoretical and practical knowledge didn't have to be permanent, that mutual respect and understanding could bridge even the widest gaps in experience and education. The conversation between them became a masterclass in humility, watched by dozens of city workers who were witnessing the birth of genuine professional respect. The news of Marcus's success spread through Detroit's municipal network like wildfire, carried by radio chatter, text messages, and phone calls that transformed him from anonymous city employee to local legend in a matter of hours. Supervisors throughout the system began calling the maintenance yard, wanting to hear first-hand accounts of how their street cleaner had outperformed a team of certified engineers. The mayor's office, which had been preparing for public embarrassment over the expensive machine breakdown, suddenly found themselves with a positive story about city employee excellence that they could share with pride. Local news stations picked up the story, recognizing its human interest appeal and its deeper meaning about recognizing talent wherever it might be found. Marcus remained characteristically humble throughout the growing attention, deflecting praise toward his father's teachings and the entire community of city workers who kept Detroit functioning every day. His dignity in the face of sudden recognition was as impressive as his technical expertise, demonstrating that true character remained constant regardless of external circumstances. The machine continued its perfect operation now serving as a symbol of what could be accomplished when expertise was properly recognized and applied. The engineer's expensive diagnostic equipment was quietly packed away as its limitations became increasingly obvious, in contrast to Marcus's intuitive approach. James Patterson found himself fascinated by the street cleaner's methodology, taking notes as Marcus explained how mechanical systems communicated through sounds, vibrations, and subtle changes that sophisticated sensors often missed. The conversation revealed the fundamental difference between knowing about machines and understanding them, between theoretical analysis and practical relationship building. Machines have personalities, Marcus explained patiently, and once you learn to recognize their individual characteristics, they'll tell you exactly what they need. The engineer nodded thoughtfully, beginning to grasp that his education had given him technical knowledge, but hadn't taught him how to develop the intuitive connection that Marcus had cultivated over decades. The other city workers listened intently as their colleague shared insights that represented generations of accumulated wisdom, his impromptu teaching session becoming a bridge between different worlds of knowledge. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the most valuable education happening that morning was being provided by someone without formal credentials to an audience that included people with advanced degrees. As word of the incident spread beyond the municipal yard, Marcus began receiving calls from friends, family, and colleagues throughout the city who had heard various versions of what had happened. His daughter Sarah called from Chicago, her voice filled with pride as she congratulated him on finally receiving the recognition he deserved. His sons, both engineers themselves, expressed amazement that their father's expertise had been validated so publicly and dramatically. Former co-workers who had retired years earlier called to share their own stories of Marcus's problem-solving abilities, adding their voices to a growing chorus of people who had always known about his exceptional skills. The transformation was remarkable. A man who had been invisible to most of the professional world suddenly found himself at the center of conversations about expertise, recognition, and the value of practical wisdom. Marcus handled the attention with characteristic grace, always redirecting conversations toward the broader community of skilled workers who kept essential services functioning. His humility in the face of recognition was as impressive as his technical competence, demonstrating that true expertise was always accompanied by genuine character and concern for others. The machine's continued perfect operation throughout the day provided constant validation of Marcus's diagnosis and repair, its steady performance silencing any remaining skeptics who might have questioned his methods. Engineers from other city departments arrived to examine the repair and learn about the troubleshooting approach that had succeeded where expensive diagnostics had failed. Each visitor left with a new understanding of the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom, carrying stories that would influence their own approaches to problem solving. James Patterson spent the entire afternoon observing Marcus's interactions with the various visitors, studying not just his technical knowledge, but his natural teaching ability and generous sharing of expertise. The young engineer was learning lessons that couldn't be found in any textbook, gaining insights about humility, respect, and the multiple forms that intelligence could take. The municipal yard had been transformed from a place of confrontation into an impromptu classroom where different kinds of knowledge were being shared and celebrated. The machine stood at the center of it all, its mechanical reliability serving as proof that some problems required not just education, but wisdom, not just analysis, but understanding. By late afternoon, the story had reached local television stations and newspapers, with reporters arriving to interview both Marcus and James Patterson about the morning's events. The contrast between their responses was striking. The engineer spoke thoughtfully about learning to appreciate different forms of expertise, while Marcus remained focused on the broader community of skilled workers who deserved recognition for their contributions. "This isn't about me," Marcus told the cameras. "It's about all the people who keep this city running every day, whose expertise gets overlooked because it doesn't come with fancy degrees." His words resonated with viewers across Detroit and beyond, many of whom recognized their own experiences in his story. The engineer's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and express admiration for Marcus's skills added depth to the narrative, showing that professional growth required humility and openness to learning from unexpected sources. The machine continued its flawless operation in the background of every interview, its mechanical voice adding testimony to the power of practical wisdom and the importance of recognizing expertise wherever it might be found. The story was becoming larger than just a repair job. It was evolving into a commentary on class, education, and the multiple ways that intelligence could manifest in the real world. The transformation in workplace dynamics was immediate and profound, with supervisors who had previously overlooked Marcus now seeking his input on equipment problems throughout the city system. His suggestions, which had been routinely dismissed for years, were suddenly being implemented and credited appropriately. Other experienced workers began speaking up more confidently about their own observations and ideas, inspired by Marcus's example to share their expertise more assertively. The artificial hierarchy that had privileged credentials over competence began to crack, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of how different types of knowledge could contribute to effective problem-solving. James Patterson extended his stay in Detroit by several days, spending time with Marcus and other city workers to learn approaches that his expensive education had never covered. The machine's repair had become a catalyst for broader changes in how the municipal system valued and utilized the expertise of its workforce. The October afternoon stretched into evening with continued discussions about practical wisdom, theoretical knowledge, and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its source or presentation. Marcus returned home that evening to a house filled with family members who had heard various accounts of the day's events and wanted to celebrate his moment of recognition. His wife Dorothy, who had supported him through decades of overlooked contributions, smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose faith had been vindicated. His children called throughout the evening to express their pride and share their own stories of the day's media coverage, which had reached far beyond Detroit's borders. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate him and share their own experiences with being underestimated because of their jobs or backgrounds. The kitchen table where he had learned his first lessons about mechanical thinking became the center of an impromptu celebration of practical wisdom and the dignity of skilled work. Marcus felt the presence of his father Samuel in the warm conversation and laughter, knowing that the old man's teachings had finally received the recognition they deserved. The simple lesson that intelligence took many forms and that expertise could emerge from unexpected places had resonated with people across the country who saw their own struggles reflected in his story. As the evening wound down and the visitors departed, Marcus sat quietly in his workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had defined his life outside of city employment. The same hands that had adjusted a simple valve and solved an expensive problem had also repaired countless household items, fixed neighbors' cars, and taught his children the value of understanding how things worked. The recognition was gratifying, but it hadn't changed who he was or what he valued most. The satisfaction of making broken things work again, the joy of sharing knowledge with others, and the dignity that came from doing excellent work regardless of external validation. Tomorrow he would return to his regular duties as a street cleaner, but something fundamental had changed in how his expertise was perceived and valued. The machine would continue to operate perfectly, its reliable performance a lasting testament to the power of practical wisdom and the importance of listening to what broken things were trying to communicate. The story would continue to spread, inspiring other working people to speak up about their own expertise and encouraging employers to recognize talent wherever it might be found. The ripple effects of that October morning would continue for years to come, influencing hiring practices, training programs, and attitudes about expertise throughout Detroit's municipal system and beyond. Marcus Washington had become more than just a street cleaner who fixed a machine. He had become a symbol of the unrecognized intelligence that existed throughout the working world, waiting for opportunities to contribute and be appreciated. His story reminded everyone that true wisdom often came dressed in work clothes rather than business suits, that the most sophisticated solutions were frequently the simplest ones, and that respect was something that should be earned through competence rather than automatically granted through credentials. The machine continued to clean Detroit streets with perfect reliability, its operation a daily reminder that some problems required not just knowledge but wisdom, not just education but experience, and not just theory but the practical understanding that came from decades of listening to what broken things were trying to say. If this story touched something in your heart, If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated because of your job or background, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own worth and wisdom. Sometimes the most important recognition we can give is to see the expertise that already exists all around us, waiting to be acknowledged and celebrated. The legacy of that morning lived on in every perfect repair, every problem solved through practical wisdom, and every moment when someone chose to listen rather than assume, to respect rather than dismiss, to recognize that intelligence came in many forms and deserved appreciation regardless of its packaging or presentation.